Hello everyone, and welcome back to Autonomia, the show where we bring ideas from the libertarian left to everyday people, and foster conversation on what we believe in hopes of proving that we all have far more in common than we are trained to believe. My name is Hayward, and I am your host. As always, our intro and outro music come from a song called A Bigger Cage is Still a Prison by System Failure. If you'd like to look up this song, the band spells System, C-I-S-T-E-M, for political reasons.
There's nothing I want more than to sleep under the night sky, hear the animals as they go about their lives, feel the fire warm my body, feel the mud under my toes, but tonight this cell keeps me enclosed.
Hello everyone, and thank you so much for tuning back in. It's certainly been quite a time away from podcasting, and while I have, probably upwards of 20 episodes somewhere in the notes or in the partially recorded phases, it's been a while since I've had both the time and the computer space to actually get something out there. But I wanted to do something just quickly. It's in relation to an ongoing discussion I've been having with my buddy Lee about the resistance around what is called Cop City down in Atlanta. And so, naturally, as an anarchist, I have certain positions and feelings about a police training facility where police around the country will be taught how to crush dissent in a simulated urban environment. I naturally have a lot of feelings about that, leaving aside the potentially constitutional entanglements around having an unincorporated county that has no representation on a city council get this facility dumped on them despite an overwhelming opposition to it without any means of actually resisting it other than physical. Anyway, what I was trying to get at is, it is important for us to resist authority. Is it important for us to resist when the government is ignoring the will of the people? And in a situation like this, the fact that it is, to me, something of a government training facility for government terrorists, leaving aside my views on that, I think it's important that anyone who is concerned about government overreach challenge this and stand against this. And we had a discussion about certain tactics and how some things are okay and some things are not okay, and violence versus nonviolence. And Lee talked about how it was a peaceful protest at first, and then things got violent, and we didn't really get into whether or not violence is or is not a legitimate form of resistance, and how, the state employs violence. And part of what defines a state as a state is a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence. So there's a crime think text actually that talks about this. It's called The Legitimacy of Violence and the Violence of Legitimacy. And basically it deconstructs this whole framing of what it is to be violent and nonviolent, and how the establishment fosters a certain understanding of nonviolence to make sure that any sort of resistance to it will be pacified to the maximum. Make sure that any sort of resistance is strictly cosmetic and can be ignored or crushed if it starts to gain traction. So, we talk about this being nonviolent, and you have a situation where these people are exhausting all official means to try to stop this thing from happening, and the government continues to ignore them, and they eventually put their bodies on the line and occupy this forest, and the government violently removes people in a raid and violently destroys things. Eventually, there was an altercation of some kind between one of the forest protectors or protesters, depending on who you talk to. One of these people got into an altercation with police, allegedly, and allegedly gunshots were exchanged. And I say allegedly because both sides have different stories, and I'm not about to say that I know definitively what happened on either side. But a lot of people took the official narrative of this defender shot at police and then was returned, had fire returned and was killed, as a way of delegitimizing it, of saying, well, that's too far. You've gone too far. This isn't okay anymore. And I wanted to call in to try to challenge that, because I think there are certain instances in which tyranny needs to be responded to with a proportional amount of force, and sometimes that force can end up being violent, because what else can you do? If you are being beaten with a stick, are you allowed to come back with a stick and hit that person? Are you allowed to use violence to defend a space when violence is being used to destroy a space? These are philosophical questions, and each person may have a different answer. But what I wanted to do was just bring up a couple examples. And so my phone call to his show, which unfortunately was somehow not recorded, it's every once in a while it happens. An episode will not be properly recorded and the audio gets lost. But basically, what I talked about is all of these different examples of people that thought they were resisting tyranny as a way of describing and understanding these tactics and commonalities that might exist. So, first thing I got into is June 1772, when Rhode Islanders see a government ship run aground. They row out to it and set it on fire. Enslaved people in Haiti grew tired of the abuses of their colonial masters and took up arms to seek their freedom. Residents of Boston pelt British law enforcement with snowballs and rocks. The British opened fire on the crowd. American resistors pull down a statue of King George and melt it down for bullets to shoot back at the British. John Brown sought to raid a government armory to begin a guerrilla warfare campaign to free the slaves, as he believed it was God's will that slavery was an abomination. Armed Mohawk warriors opened fire on Canadian police trying to clear them from their forest and burial grounds in order to make room for a golf course. French politicians tried to change the retirement age to keep people working longer, and in support of the movement against this, French electrical workers cut power to politicians' homes. Students in Hong Kong enact mass campaigns of destruction and resistance to protest the expansion of Chinese government power over their semi-autonomous city. This escalates to students occupying a university as a fortress while members of the archery team shot police from the rooftops. Russian anarchists opposed to the war in Ukraine blow up rail lines headed for the front lines and burn recruitment stations. American ranchers take up arms in protest of what they saw as a threat to their livelihood. The French president dumps a profoundly damaging fuel tax on his people. French workers don high-vis vests and spend the next few weeks tearing Paris apart and pelting police who sided with the government with rocks and fire. The tax was withdrawn. Residents of an unincorporated county in Georgia and their allies physically resist after all other measures were tried and failed to stop the destruction of a forest designated the lungs of the county by the government's own environmental studies, and trying to build a facility that, among other things, trains government employees to crush dissent. They refuse to surrender and decide to resist. So the thing to think about in all of these is who are the good guys and who are the bad guys in these situations. You feel how you feel about these events, and, if you've been made aware of them, it's very likely that you've been informed by your culture and by the media that you're plugged into. So these proud loyalists cheering on the empire, this repression will come for you eventually. That's how it always works. And you'll have nobody to blame but yourselves because you stood aside while the people who saw what was coming were smashed. Look at all these different instances. And I pulled some stories from things that a lot of Americans might say were good. The burning of the Gatsby, or pulling down of the statue of King George, erasing history maybe. Throwing rocks at British law enforcement. These are things that if they were to happen today, the proud flag-waving patriots would think is terrorism, would think is completely unacceptable. We have certain preconditioned understandings of conflict with governments, and usually if a few hundred years have gone by, our attitudes can change because we have the benefit of hindsight, of hundreds of years of trajectory and understandings of what happened. And so in those moments, you don't think there were people saying, just obey the law and everything will be okay? You don't think there were people that said, stop resisting, or you've gone too far when you break the law? And that's what happens every single time these conflicts happen. There were people in France during the Yellow Vest movement saying that this wasn't okay. There were people all over the place saying that the protests in Hong Kong were not okay because they were going too far. But your actual opinions are very heavily informed by what your politics are. There were people who thought that the Bundy situation was completely farcical. But the truth of the matter is whether or not you support it or not is not so much relevant to the overall point that I'm getting at here. The thing is they were doing something that they believed was a righteous cause, using guns to do it and going toe-to-toe with the government. And so with the folks on the right who might be inclined to support the Bundys, you have to ask yourself, why are you not inclined to support resistance movements on the left that are using similar tactics? Because more often than not, you folks will say that those tactics are completely illegitimate. And when you use violence, you cease to be legitimate and you need to be peaceful. And so the definition of violence ends up being kind of a floating signifier. People would say that leftist protesters protecting a space with arms is violent and terroristic. But you see folks at the Bundy Ranch doing the same thing, protecting a space with arms, and suddenly it's not terroristic. That's how you have to challenge these double standards in order to actually figure out where you believe and what is and isn't okay. You're allowed to believe that armed resistance is never okay. I think you're wrong, but you're allowed to believe that. That is a position that exists, and people have that and have principles, and unfortunately, those people very rarely succeed, because the government has no such limitations and no such moral hang-ups about the implication of violence. And so you have people all throughout history realizing this contradiction, realizing this strategic dilemma and saying, what do we do about this? Do we die on our moral high horse knowing that we have been pure? Or do we say, no, we're going to rise to the challenge that exists? Do we realize the difficult situation we are in and take appropriate action to survive, or do we be slaughtered? It's a dilemma that to me isn't much of a dilemma, but to other people it might be. And so when you recognize that violence is a fact of this world, when you recognize that the government by default is a violent institution, and is it violent to respond to that violence with defensive violence of your own? Is it wrong for a person who is being beaten to stand up and punch back? I certainly think not, but maybe you feel differently. So whenever dealing with these conversations, whenever dealing with these understandings, you have to really challenge yourself and say, why do I believe what I believe? Why do I have these perspectives? What gave me these perspectives? Who gave me these perspectives? Do I actually agree with these perspectives? Am I being a hypocrite by selectively applying these standards? These are things you really have to grapple with in order to figure out how you really feel about these situations. So maybe the next time you see folks on a team that isn't yours, maybe you see folks dressed in black, folks looking in ways that you've been preconditioned to believe are scary and terroristic, maybe the next time you see them do things, maybe actually take a second to ask and understand why they're doing it. Because maybe you might just find, wow, I might agree with some of those grievances, and maybe you don't. But at least you've given the intellectual effort necessary to even figure out where you stand on the issues, rather than just defaulting to the talking points and defaulting to the perspectives that corporate-funded media wants you to think. You have to ask yourself, why does a corporate-funded institution, why does a news agency owned by billionaires want me to hate these people? Why do they want me to think these people are doing a bad thing? Chances are it's because what they're doing is not advantageous to billionaires. And, maybe that means something to you. Maybe that makes you think, what's going on here? That's all I'm getting at here. Think. Explore more information. Challenge yourself to find holes in your understanding. Challenge yourself to the possibility that you might have some hypocritical beliefs, and then do something about it. See what you can do. Thank you so much for listening. Have a great day, and resist. Thank you so much for listening to today's podcast episode. This project is done on a DIY basis on extremely antiquated equipment. And if this is something you'd like to hear more of, and maybe you're feeling particularly generous, you can head on over to patreon.com/Auftonomia. That's patreon.com/AFTONOMIA. I'm still looking to figure out what kind of benefits I can offer to any of my subscribers other than my undying gratitude. But if you feel like supporting the show, it would be very helpful. I am a father of 2, husband of 1, trying to provide for my family and do whatever I can to make this world a place I don't have to apologize to those children for. I'd really appreciate any support that happens. Obviously, if you can't, I totally get it. I know how it feels to be up against the wall financially. So thank you so much for listening, and have a great day.
'Cause there's nothing I want more than to sleep under the night sky. The animals as they go about their lives. Feel the fire warm my body, feel the mud under my toes. But tonight this hell keeps me enclosed. For if we don't have our freedom, if we are captured by their iron hands, then the vision for fire, it burns so much more bright. There's no justice in the system, a bigger cage is still a prison. Well, I hope that somewhere someone breaks free tonight.